Hey friends! Tonight, we're diving into 3 incredible Greek myths about love tested in the darkest, most mysterious places imaginable. Picture feasts that vanish like smoke, someone making the ultimate descent into death itself for love, and a soul facing its most profound trial. If you're discovering these stories for the first time, drop it in the comments, and a quick like helps these tales reach other peaceful nights. So get cozy with me as we step away from the familiar world and venture into something far more mysterious. Our first story begins beneath ancient trees where nothing is what it seems. In the Golden Age, when gods walked freely among mortals, and the boundaries between earth and heaven were gossamer thin, Zeus looked down from Mount Olympus with the satisfaction of a father watching his creation flourish. The world bloomed with divine favor, blessed by immortal hands that guided seasons and harvests, that whispered wisdom to kings and inspiration to poets. But among all mortals, there was one who held a place closer to the throne of heaven than any other had dared to dream. The fates had spun his thread with gold, marking him as one destined to bridge the gap between human ambition and divine grace. Yet even they, in their ancient wisdom, could not foresee how that very blessing would become the seed of his destruction. For the gods, in their generosity, sometimes forget that mortals were not designed to bear the full weight of immortal favor without consequence. Tantalus ruled the kingdom of Lydia from a palace that seemed carved from captured sunlight, its walls gleaming with marble so pure it reflected not just images, but dreams. He was a king among kings, his wisdom celebrated from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains where eagles nested, his wealth so vast that other rulers journeyed for months simply to glimpse the splendor of his court. But wealth and wisdom, great as they were, paled beside his greatest treasure. He was loved by the gods themselves. Not feared, as most mortals were, not merely tolerated or occasionally blessed, but truly loved. Zeus called him friend and welcomed him to feasts on Mount Olympus. Athena sought his counsel on matters of justice and governance. Apollo shared with him the secrets of music and prophecy. Aphrodite smiled upon his court, blessing it with beauty and harmony that made poets weep for joy. "You are more than mortal, dear Tantalus," Zeus had said one evening as they shared wine that tasted of starlight and eternity. "In your presence, even we gods remember what it means to have a friend who appreciates our gifts without coveting our power." It was the highest praise any mortal had ever received, and for years Tantalus treasured those words above all his earthly possessions. He wore the friendship of the gods like a crown, and indeed, it elevated him far above any golden circlet could have done. His palace became a place where heaven touched earth. Divine visitors arrived weekly, sometimes daily, transforming his court into something that existed halfway between the mortal world and Olympus itself. Nymphs danced in his gardens, their laughter like silver bells carried on impossible breezes. Muses recited epic poems by his fountains, their voices weaving tales that made listeners forget their own names. Gods shared ambrosia at his table, and the very air around the palace shimmered with possibility. Tantalus reveled in this life between worlds. He learned the private jokes that made Apollo laugh until tears streamed down his divine face. He discovered which wines Dionysus preferred on melancholy evenings. He could predict the exact moment when Artemis would grow restless during formal dinners and suggest a hunt to ease her divine impatience. But as seasons turned to years, and years accumulated into decades, something shifted in his heart. The wonder that had once filled him at each divine visitation began to fade, replaced by an expectation that felt dangerously close to entitlement. "My lord," his eldest counselor said one morning as they reviewed petitions from distant provinces, "perhaps it is time to remember that even divine friendship comes with responsibilities." Tantalus looked up from a scroll written in Hermes's flowing hand, an invitation to witness the birth of a new constellation. "What do you mean?" "Only that the gods honor you with their presence, because you have always understood your place in the cosmic order. You receive their gifts with gratitude, not expectation. But lately—" The old man hesitated, choosing his words with the care of one who had served his king for 40 years. "Lately what?" "Lately, you speak of divine visits as if they were your due, rather than your blessing. When Apollo was delayed last month, you complained of his tardiness. When Athena brought you knowledge of a coming plague in the eastern provinces, you asked why she hadn't prevented it entirely." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Tantalus had grown comfortable in his elevated position, had begun to take for granted privileges that other mortals would sacrifice kingdoms to experience even once. But instead of heeding his counselor's gentle warning, Tantalus felt a flash of irritation. "I am the friend of Zeus himself. Am I not entitled to certain expectations? Should I not question gods who claim to care for my kingdom but allow suffering to touch its borders?" The old counselor's face went pale. "My lord, such words—" "Are the words of someone who has earned the right to speak them," Tantalus interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of pride that had not been there in his younger days. "The gods themselves have elevated me above other mortals. Why should I pretend otherwise?" That evening, as if summoned by his hubris, Zeus himself appeared in the palace courtyard. But there was something different about the king of the gods, a watchfulness in his eyes, a measuring quality to his gaze that had never been there before. "My friend," Zeus said, embracing Tantalus with warmth that felt genuine but somehow careful, "I have come with an invitation. Would you join us tomorrow for a feast on Olympus, a celebration of the autumn harvest and of the friendship between gods and mortals?" "Of course," Tantalus replied, though part of him wondered why the invitation felt more like a test than a gesture of affection. "Though I must say, your recent absences have been noted. My court grows lonely without divine company." Zeus smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Indeed, we have been observing from afar. Sometimes distance provides clarity that proximity cannot." The next day, Tantalus made the journey to Mount Olympus along paths that existed only for those specifically invited by the gods. The ascent took him through layers of reality, each step carrying him further from the mortal world and closer to realms where thoughts became reality and will shaped the very air. He arrived to find the great hall of the gods prepared for celebration. Golden tables laden with fruits that grew only in immortal gardens, wine that had been aged in the cellars of eternity itself. The assembled gods greeted him with smiles and embraces, but beneath their warmth, he sensed something new, a subtle distance, as if they were watching him through invisible glass. "Welcome, honored guest," Hera said, her voice carrying the formal tones of ceremony rather than the casual warmth of friendship. "Please take your place at the table of honor." The feast that followed was magnificent beyond description, with dishes that satisfied hungers mortals didn't even know they possessed, entertainment provided by the muses themselves, conversation that ranged from the secrets of creation to speculations about the ultimate fate of the cosmos. But as the evening progressed, Tantalus felt increasingly unsettled. The gods were treating him well, exceptionally well in fact, but there was something theatrical about their attention, as if each gesture and word had been rehearsed. "Tell me, friend Tantalus," Zeus said as the evening reached its peak, "what do you think of this feast? Does it meet with your approval?" The question seemed simple enough, but Tantalus heard layers beneath it that he couldn't quite decipher. "It is magnificent, as always, though I must admit I find myself curious about the formality of tonight's proceedings. Usually our gatherings are more relaxed." "Ah, but this is a special occasion," Zeus replied, his voice carrying subtle harmonics that made the words resonate strangely. "Tonight we celebrate not just friendship, but understanding, the perfect comprehension between divine and mortal perspectives." "Understanding? Indeed. You see, we have been watching you, dear friend, and we have noticed certain changes, a shift in how you perceive your relationship with us. We thought perhaps it was time to address these changes directly." A chill ran down Tantalus's spine, but his pride prevented him from showing fear. "I'm not sure I know what you mean." "Don't you?" Apollo leaned forward, his golden hair catching light that seemed to come from within him. "When I was delayed visiting your court last month, you spoke to your servants of my thoughtlessness. When Athena warned you of plague, you questioned her wisdom in not preventing the disease entirely. When Dionysus honored your harvest festival with his presence, you complained privately that he stayed only 2 days instead of a week." The accuracy of these observations struck Tantalus like physical blows. He had indeed said all of these things, but in the privacy of his own palace, to his own servants. The realization that the gods had been listening, watching, judging his every word and thought filled him with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Am I not allowed private thoughts?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Must I perform gratitude even when alone?" "Gratitude is not a performance," Athena said quietly, her gray eyes reflecting depths of wisdom that made him feel suddenly small. "True gratitude springs from understanding the magnitude of what has been given, not from calculation of what is expected in return." "I have always been grateful." "Have you?" Zeus's voice carried the weight of storm clouds and absolute authority. Or have you simply learned to say the words while your heart counted divine gifts as debts owed to your worthiness? The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning, and Tantalus felt the truth of them settling into his bones with uncomfortable precision. When had his wonder at divine friendship transformed into expectation? When had blessing become entitlement in his mind? But his pride, stung by the accuracy of their observations, rose to meet their challenge. Perhaps the real question is whether gods who claim to love friendship should spy on their friends' private moments. Is this how immortals treat those they honor with their regard? The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Every god at the table turned to look at Tantalus with expressions that ranged from surprise to sorrow to barely contained anger. He had just accused the rulers of the cosmos of betraying friendship, had questioned their right to judge him, had implied that their love came with conditions he found unfair. In that moment, he realized he had crossed a line he couldn't even see until he was already on the other side of it. "Very well," Zeus said at last, his voice carrying the finality of cosmic law. "You question our understanding of friendship. You suggest that our gifts should come without judgment, our love without expectations of appropriate response. Let us see how well your own understanding serves you." The king of the gods gestured, and reality shifted around Tantalus like water flowing into new patterns. The magnificent hall of Olympus faded, replaced by a landscape of gray stone and dim light that he recognized with growing horror as the underworld. "You shall have what you have always truly wanted," Zeus continued, his words echoing strangely in the new space. "Eternal life, so that divine friendship need never be interrupted by mortal death. And you shall have abundant gifts, water and fruit always within sight, always available, always offered freely without judgment or condition." Tantalus found himself standing in a pool of clear, cool water that reached nearly to his chest. Above him hung branches heavy with fruit, apples that gleamed like rubies, pears that seemed carved from golden light, grapes that promised wine sweeter than ambrosia. The water looked pure and inviting, the fruit ripe and perfect. "There," Zeus said, his form beginning to fade as the connection to Olympus dissolved. "You need never again worry about divine expectations or the conditions of friendship. Everything you could desire is yours to take, freely given, without judgment or limitation." Only as he reached for an apple, hanging just above his head, did Tantalus understand the true nature of his gift. The fruit retreated at his touch, the branch swaying just out of reach no matter how he stretched or jumped. When he bent to drink from the pool, the water receded, sinking below his waist, then his knees, leaving only damp stone where clear liquid had sparkled moments before. "No," he whispered, lunging for a cluster of grapes that danced away from his grasping fingers like living things. "No, this cannot be." But it was. As he watched in growing horror, he understood that he would spend eternity in this place, tormented not by the absence of sustenance, but by its eternal presence just beyond his reach. He would never die of thirst, for the curse would not permit even that release, but neither would he ever drink. He would never starve, but he would never taste food again. The punishment was perfectly crafted to reflect his crime. He had taken divine friendship for granted, had expected gifts without appreciation, had counted blessings as debts owed to his worth. Now he would have gifts eternal, water and fruit always present, always offered, never received, because his own nature would prevent him from accepting what was freely given. Days passed, or perhaps years. Time moved strangely in the underworld, marked only by the rhythm of his futile reaching and the echo of his frustrated cries. He learned the exact distance the fruit would retreat, the precise moment when the water would recede. He discovered that his torment was perfectly calibrated, the promise of satisfaction always present, always denied, always renewed. But slowly, in the depths of his eternal punishment, understanding began to dawn. He thought of his counselor's gentle warning, of the concerned expressions on the faces of gods who had genuinely cared for him. He remembered the moment when Zeus's warmth had first begun to feel careful rather than spontaneous, and realized it had coincided exactly with his own shift from gratitude to expectation. "I did this to myself," he whispered to the fruit that hung forever beyond his grasp. "They didn't take their friendship away. I poisoned it with entitlement until they had no choice but to respond." The realization brought no relief from his physical torment, but it eased something deeper, the anger and resentment that had been growing in his heart like poison. He had blamed the gods for their judgment, but the truth was that he had judged himself. Every moment he had taken their gifts for granted, every time he had counted divine favor as his due, he had built this prison of eternal want. Years turned to decades, decades to centuries, and still Tantalus stood in his pool of retreating water, reaching for fruit that danced away from his fingers. But his understanding deepened with time, and with it came something unexpected, a kind of peace. He began to notice things he had missed in his initial desperation. The water, though he could never drink it, was beautiful in its clarity. The fruit, though forever beyond his reach, filled the air with sweetness that was almost like nourishment for his spirit. The very consistency of his punishment became a meditation on desire itself, on the difference between want and need, between appreciation and acquisition. "You were right," he said aloud one day, speaking to gods who might or might not be listening. "Gratitude cannot be performed. It can only be felt. And I had forgotten how to feel it." Whether his words carried beyond the boundaries of his prison, he never knew. But as eternities passed and his understanding grew deeper, he began to find something like contentment in his torment. Not happiness, that was beyond him now, but a quiet acceptance that felt almost like peace. He learned to find beauty in the moment of reaching, even knowing he would never grasp what he sought. He discovered meditation in the rhythm of water receding and returning, in the dance of fruit swaying just beyond touch. Most importantly, he learned the difference between having and appreciating, between possessing and treasuring. The water sparkled with light that seemed to come from within itself, casting ripples of silver across the gray stone of his prison. The fruit glowed with colors that had no names in mortal language, their perfection unchanged by the passage of eons. And though he could never drink or eat, he found sustenance in their beauty that was deeper than physical satisfaction. Other souls occasionally passed through his section of the underworld, and some paused to speak with him. They expected to find a man broken by eternal frustration, driven mad by unending want. Instead, they found someone who had learned to find meaning in meaninglessness, who had discovered that some hungers could be fed by understanding rather than consumption. "Does it not drive you to despair?" asked a newly arrived soul, watching as Tantalus reached once more for an apple that retreated like a coy lover. "It did, for the first few centuries," Tantalus replied calmly, his hand falling back to his side with practiced acceptance. "But despair, I learned, was just another form of entitlement, the belief that I deserved better than what I had received. Once I let go of that belief, the punishment became something else entirely. What did it become?" Tantalus considered the question, watching light play across the surface of water that would forever retreat from his touch. "A teacher," he said at last. "The most patient, persistent teacher I have ever known. It has taught me the difference between wanting and appreciating, between grasping and receiving, between taking for granted and treasuring what is given." The soul stared at him in amazement. "You speak as if you are grateful for your torment." "Not grateful exactly," Tantalus said thoughtfully, "but understanding. I brought this upon myself through my failure to appreciate what I had been given. The gods didn't create my punishment. They simply made visible the prison I had already built from my own expectations and entitlement. In that sense, this eternal reaching has become a kind of purification, burning away everything false until only truth remains." He reached again for the fruit, his movement fluid and graceful after eons of practice, and smiled slightly as it danced away from his fingers. "Besides, look at it. Have you ever seen anything more beautiful? Even if I could pluck it and eat it, would that single moment of consumption be worth more than this eternal dance of desire and beauty?" The soul departed, shaking its head in bewilderment, but Tantalus remained content in his pool of retreating water, reaching for fruit that would always elude him, finding in his eternal punishment a strange kind of completeness. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the greatest gifts were often invisible until they were gone, and that appreciation required no possession, only presence. The water continued to sparkle and retreat. The fruit continued to glow and dance away from his touch, and in the consistent rhythm of eternal longing, Tantalus found a peace deeper than satisfaction. He had become, in his way, what the gods had always hoped he might be. Not a possessor of divine gifts, but a true appreciator of their beauty, even when that appreciation could never be consummated by acquisition. in the quiet halls of eternal punishment, where lessons were learned through repetition and understanding came only through acceptance, the rhythm of reaching and retreating had become its own kind of prayer, an endless meditation on the nature of desire itself, and on the possibility that some thirsts could only be satisfied by learning not to drink. But the underworld holds many chambers, and in another hall entirely, a different kind of love was being tested by the ultimate sacrifice, where devotion would prove stronger than death itself, and the bonds of marriage would be stretched across the very boundary between life and the world below. In the age when the fates still wove their threads with visible hands, and destiny could sometimes be bargained with rather than merely accepted, Apollo walked the earth under the weight of his father's anger. Zeus had struck down the god's beloved son with lightning, and in his grief and rage, Apollo had responded by killing the cyclopaths who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. It was an act of rebellion that shook Mount Olympus itself, forcing even the king of the gods to impose consequences that would echo through mortal lives for generations to come. The punishment was as elegant as it was humbling. Apollo, god of light and music, prophecy and healing, would serve for 1 full year as a mortal shepherd, stripped of his divine powers, bound to the earth he had so often gazed upon from celestial heights. The cosmic order demanded that even gods learn the weight of consequence, that divine grief be tempered by understanding of the mortal condition. But the threads of fate, once disturbed, weave patterns that touch lives far beyond the original disturbance. Apollo's exile would bring him to the court of King Admetus of Pherae, and there, in that intersection of divine punishment and mortal kindness, a love story would unfold that would challenge death itself. Admetus was the kind of king that poets write songs about, young, just, beloved by his people, and blessed with the sort of quiet wisdom that made even hardened warriors trust his judgment. His palace sat on a hill overlooking fertile valleys where sheep grazed in meadows starred with wildflowers, and olive groves caught the morning light like silver nets cast across the landscape. When a stranger appeared at his gates, claiming to be nothing more than a skilled shepherd seeking honest work, Admetus saw past the man's simple clothes to something that glowed beneath the surface. Not divinity, for Apollo's true nature was hidden even from himself during his punishment, but the unmistakable quality of someone who had known great things and lost them. "Your name?" Admetus asked, studying the newcomer with eyes that missed little. "I am called Alcestis," Apollo said, choosing a name that was true but incomplete. He could not remember his godhood during this exile, but he carried within him echoes of power, fragments of knowledge that felt like half-remembered dreams. "Well then, Alcestis, if you can gentle my most stubborn ram and heal my prize ewe's injured leg, you'll have work for as long as you wish to stay." Apollo approached the animals with movements that seemed to carry music in them, and when he touched the ewe's wounded limb, it healed with a completeness that went beyond normal recovery. The ram, known for its aggressive temperament, grew calm under his hands as if recognizing something ancient and trustworthy. "How did you learn such skills?" Admetus asked, genuinely curious rather than suspicious. I'm not sure," Apollo admitted, his mortal form struggling with memories that existed just beyond recall. It feels like something I've always known, though I cannot remember learning it. So began a year unlike any other in the history of Pherae. Under Loxias's care, the royal flocks grew healthier and more numerous than they had ever been. Ewes that had been barren for years gave birth to strong lambs. Sick animals recovered overnight. Predators seemed to avoid the pastures entirely, as if held back by invisible barriers. But more than the miraculous improvements to the livestock, the court of Admetus began to change in subtler ways. The shepherd's presence brought a quality of peace that settled into the very stones of the palace. Disputes that might have festered were resolved with unexpected wisdom. The king's advisors found themselves speaking more thoughtfully, their words carrying weight they hadn't possessed before. "There is something about this Loxias," Admetus confided to his closest friend as they watched the shepherd leading the flocks to pasture, his movements graceful in ways that seemed to choreograph the very landscape around him. "When he speaks, even the simplest observations sound like prophecy. Perhaps he is touched by the gods," his friend suggested. "Perhaps," Admetus agreed, but his thoughts were already turning to other matters. For at the edge of his contentment, a restlessness was growing, not dissatisfaction with his kingdom or his duties, but the particular restlessness of a man who had reached the age when solitude becomes a burden rather than a blessing. It was during the spring festival, when representatives from neighboring kingdoms came to celebrate the season of renewal, that Admetus first saw Alcestis. She arrived as part of her father's delegation from Iolcos, riding a horse the color of honey, her dark hair braided with flowers that seemed to have chosen her rather than been picked for decoration. She was beautiful, but in the way that mountain streams are beautiful, not for display, but as a natural expression of something pure and essential. When she laughed at one of the court jester's stories, the sound was clear as temple bells. When she spoke during the formal presentations, her words carried the weight of genuine thought rather than diplomatic pleasantries. "Who is she?" Admetus asked his seneschal, trying to sound casual despite the way his heart had begun racing the moment she entered his great hall. "Lady Alcestis, daughter of King Peleus of Iolcos. They say she has refused 17 suitors, claiming none of them understood the difference between loving a woman and wanting to possess a beautiful object." That evening, at the great feast welcoming the visiting delegations, Admetus found himself seated across from Alcestis by what appeared to be chance but felt like destiny. The conversation that followed ranged from philosophy to agriculture, from poetry to the practical challenges of governing in uncertain times. "You speak of kingship as if it were a calling rather than a privilege," she observed, as servants cleared away the remains of the 7th course. "Isn't it?" Admetus replied. "Every decision I make affects hundreds of lives. Every law I pass changes the world, if only in small ways. How could that be anything but a sacred responsibility?" She studied his face with the direct attention of someone trying to read the truth written in another person's eyes. "Most rulers speak of their power. You speak of your duty. Power without purpose is just elaborate selfishness. I'd rather be a good shepherd than a bad king. And if you could be both?" The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and in that moment, both of them understood that something profound was beginning. The courtship that followed was unlike the formal negotiations that usually accompanied royal marriages. Admetus came to Iolcos not with armies or great gifts, but with honesty that was more valuable than gold. He spoke to Alcestis of his dreams for his kingdom, his fears about his own worthiness, his hope that he might find someone who could see past his crown to the man beneath it. "I have 17 rings in my treasury," she told him as they walked through her father's gardens one afternoon, the air sweet with jasmine and the distant sound of fountains. "Gifts from princes and kings who wanted to marry me for my beauty or my father's wealth or the political advantages I might bring to their kingdoms." "And what did you want them to see?" he asked. "Someone who loves justice more than comfort. Someone who understands that true strength is knowing when not to use your power. Someone who would rule not because he was born to it, but because he genuinely cares about making the world better than he found it." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "And have you found such a person?" "I think I might have," she said softly, and when he took her hands in his, both of them understood that they were making promises that went deeper than any formal vows could reach. Their wedding was celebrated throughout both kingdoms, blessed by every god whose favor could be invoked. The ceremony took place in a grove sacred to Hera, goddess of marriage, and as they spoke their vows, even the trees seemed to lean in to listen. Birds fell silent during the most sacred moments, as if the whole world held its breath to witness this union. But among the guests, one figure watched with particular intensity. Loxias the shepherd had been given a place of honor at the celebration, for his care of the royal flocks had been so exceptional that Admetus counted him among his most valued servants. Yet, as he watched the king and his bride exchange rings, something stirred in him. Memories that were not quite memories, knowledge that felt like recognition. When Admetus lifted Alcestis's veil and kissed her for the first time as his wife, Apollo's true nature blazed through his mortal disguise for just an instant. The god of prophecy saw what was coming with clarity that struck him like a physical blow. This happiness would not last. The threads of fate had been disturbed by his own punishment, and consequences were already weaving themselves around the mortal king who had shown him such kindness. The sight of what was to come filled him with desperate urgency to prevent it, even if it meant revealing his true identity. That night, as the wedding feast continued with music and dancing that would last until dawn, Apollo approached the king and queen. His mortal disguise had fallen away, revealing his divine nature in all its terrible beauty. "My lord," Alcestis whispered, recognizing him instantly for what he was, "you are no mortal shepherd." "I am Apollo," he said simply, "and I owe your husband a debt that I fear I cannot fully repay. Admetus showed me kindness when I was bound by my father's punishment to walk the earth in mortal form. He treated me with respect and generosity, never knowing who I truly was." Admetus stared at the god who had served in his pastures for a full year, understanding flooding his features. The miracles with the flocks, the wisdom you shared. You were exiled here. Yes, and now my exile ends. I can see what the fates have woven for you in return for your kindness." Apollo's face was grave with sorrow. "Tomorrow you will fall ill with a fever that no mortal physician can cure. Within 7 days you will die unless someone can be found to take your place in the realm of the dead." The words fell into the celebration like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and fear through the small group gathered around them. Alcestis felt her heart stop for a moment before beginning to beat again with fierce determination. "There must be something we can do," she said, "some way to change this fate." "I have already done what I can," Apollo replied sadly. "I bargained with the fates themselves, used every favor owed to me, traded years of my own divine service for this single concession. If someone who truly loves Admetus will willingly take his place in death, he will be spared. But it must be someone who chooses freely, without coercion or trickery." "His parents," Admetus said immediately. "They are old and they love me deeply. Surely." "I have already asked them," Apollo said gently. "When faced with the reality of death, even parental love has its limits. They said they had lived full lives and deserved to see their grandchildren grow. They suggested perhaps a loyal servant might be willing to make the sacrifice." Admetus closed his eyes, the weight of bitter understanding settling onto his shoulders. Love, it seemed, was easy to proclaim, but harder to prove when it demanded everything. "I will go," Alcestis said quietly. Both men stared at her, but she met their gaze with calm certainty that was more frightening than any emotional outburst would have been. "Alcestis, no," Admetus said, reaching for her hands. "We have been married for less than a day. You barely know me. You cannot throw away your life for the man I love," she interrupted. "For the king who will bring justice and prosperity to thousands of people. For the husband who sees ruling as a sacred trust rather than personal privilege." She smiled, and the expression was radiant despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. "Admetus, you are worth 10 of me. The world needs you in ways it will never need me. That's not true." "It is true, and we both know it." She touched his face gently, memorizing the feel of his skin beneath her palms. "Besides, this is my choice to make. For once in my life, I can do something that matters completely, something that will echo through generations. How many people ever get such an opportunity?" "But you'll be dead," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "And you'll be alive to remember me, to honor what I gave you by being the king you were meant to be, to love again when the time comes, and to teach your children that love is not possession, but gift freely given." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promises that would never be fulfilled. "That seems like a fair trade to me." The fever struck Admetus the next morning, just as Apollo had foretold. It came with a suddenness that left no doubt of its supernatural origin, burning through his body like fire consuming dry wood. Within hours, he was barely conscious, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and labored. Alcestis sat beside his bed throughout the first day and night, bathing his face with cool water, speaking to him of their brief time together, of the future they had planned and would never share. She told him stories of her childhood, sang songs her mother had taught her, promised him that she would find a way to watch over his kingdom from whatever realm waited beyond death. On the second day, she began to feel the pull herself, a gentle tugging at her spirit, as if invisible hands were beckoning her toward a door she could not yet see. The sensation was not unpleasant, merely inevitable, like the tide calling to the shore. "It's time," she whispered to Apollo, who had remained at the palace despite the return of his divine nature. "I can feel it beginning." The god nodded sadly. "Death comes for you now instead of him, but know that your sacrifice will be remembered for as long as mortals tell stories of love and courage." Alcestis smiled and took her husband's burning hand in hers. As she did, she felt the fever pass from his body into hers, felt his breathing ease as hers began to labor. The exchange was gentle but absolute, a transfer of fate that left no room for reversal. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered as consciousness began to slip away from her. "Rule well, love deeply. Remember that some gifts can only be given once, but they echo forever." She died as the sun set on their second day of marriage, her hand still clasped in her husband's, her face peaceful as if she had simply chosen to sleep. And in the moment of her passing, Admetus opened his eyes, completely healed, to find his bride cold and still beside him. The kingdom mourned as it had never mourned before. Alcestis had been queen for only 2 days, but in those brief hours she had shown them what true nobility looked like. Her funeral was attended by representatives from every corner of the known world, and the songs sung in her honor spoke of love that conquered even death through willing sacrifice. But the story did not end with her burial, for among the mourners stood Heracles, greatest of heroes, who had arrived too late for the wedding, but in time to witness the funeral. When he learned the truth of how Alcestis had died, his face grew dark with a resolve that made even gods take notice. "This cannot stand," he declared to Admetus as they stood beside the fresh grave. "She was too young, too good, too necessary to this world. I will not let her sacrifice be wasted through permanent loss. Heracles, she is dead. Even your strength cannot change that." "Cannot it?" The hero smiled grimly and began strapping on armor that gleamed like captured starlight. "I have wrestled with gods and won. I have descended to the underworld before and returned. Death himself is strong, but I am stronger, and I carry with me something he cannot match." "What is that?" "The power of a story that deserves a better ending." And so Heracles descended to the realm of the dead, not as a supplicant seeking mercy, but as a hero demanding justice. He found Hades in his palace of shadows and challenged the god of the dead to single combat, with Alcestis's soul as the prize. The battle that followed shook the foundations of the underworld itself. Heracles fought with the strength of righteousness, while Hades defended with the authority of cosmic law. In the end, it was not strength that won the day, but the recognition of something unprecedented. A mortal who had chosen death not from despair or duty, but from pure, freely given love. She should not have died so young, Hades admitted as he yielded to Heracles' superior power. And her husband should not have to bear such loss for the simple crime of showing kindness to a god. Very well, let love have its victory this once. When Alcestis opened her eyes, she was lying in her marriage bed with Admetus's arms around her, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the kingdom they would rule together for many years to come. The taste of pomegranate lingered on her tongue, a reminder of her brief stay in the realm of the dead, but she was alive, warm, and whole. "Did I dream it all?" she whispered. "No," Admetus replied, his voice rough with tears of joy and relief. "You died for me, and Heracles brought you back. But the love that made your sacrifice possible, that was real. That will always be real." They ruled Pherae together for 40 years after that, and their reign was marked by justice, prosperity, and a deep understanding of how precious and fragile happiness could be. They never forgot the lesson learned in those terrible 3 days, that love is not a feeling, but a choice, not a possession, but a gift, not a promise of endless time, but a commitment to make whatever time you have meaningful. When death finally came for them, it came gently, on the same night, as they slept peacefully in each other's arms. And those who found them said they looked like young lovers still, their faces touched with the serenity of those who had learned that the greatest victory over death is not avoiding it, but refusing to let it make you afraid to love completely while you live. The story of Alcestis reminds us that the deepest love is measured not in the length of time we have together, but in what we are willing to give for each other's happiness. In her brief reign and briefer death, she showed the world that some sacrifices transform not just individual lives, but the very understanding of what love can accomplish when it is freely and completely given. But in the shadowed halls where such stories echo through eternity, one final tale awaits. A story of trials that test not just love, but the very nature of the soul itself, where beauty and beast dance together in chambers lit by more than torchlight. In the high halls of Olympus, where marble columns reached toward eternity and golden light never dimmed, Aphrodite sat upon her throne with fury burning in her perfect features. The goddess of love had watched mortals worship beauty for countless ages, but never had she seen such devotion lavished upon a human girl. Psyche, they called her, a name that meant soul, and the people came from distant lands just to glimpse her face. They brought flowers meant for Aphrodite's altars and laid them at Psyche's feet instead. "Foolish mortals," the goddess whispered, her voice like silk drawn across a blade. "They forget that beauty belongs to the divine, not to creatures of dust and flesh." She summoned her son Eros, god of desire, whose golden arrows could make any heart burn with love or freeze with indifference. "Find this Psyche," she commanded. "Make her fall in love with the most wretched creature you can find. Let her beauty serve only to torment her." But even gods cannot predict the whims of the heart. When Eros found Psyche walking in her father's garden, her dark hair capturing the afternoon sun like captured starlight, he drew back his bow with practiced ease. Yet, as he took aim, the girl turned toward a butterfly that had landed on her wrist, and her smile was so gentle, so filled with wonder at the small creature's delicate wings, that the god's hand trembled. The arrow slipped, and instead of striking its intended target, it pierced his own heart. For the first time in his immortal existence, Eros knew what it meant to love. Meanwhile, in the mortal realm, Psyche found herself increasingly alone. Suitors came to gaze upon her beauty, but left without proposals. Their hearts somehow turned cold in her presence. Her two sisters married and departed for distant kingdoms, leaving her to wander the empty corridors of her father's palace like a ghost of her former happiness. "Perhaps the gods are angry with us," her father said one morning, his face creased with worry. "The people worship you as if you were divine. We must consult the oracle." The journey to the oracle's cave took 3 days across rocky hills where olive trees grew gnarled and ancient. The priestess, her eyes white with divine sight, breathed in the sacred vapors that rose from the earth's depths and spoke in a voice not entirely her own. The girl must be taken to the high cliff where the west wind blows strongest. There she must be left alone, dressed as a bride, to meet her husband, a creature so terrible that even the gods fear him, a serpent whose wings darken the sky and whose poison kills with a touch. Psyche's mother collapsed, weeping, but Psyche herself stood straighter, her chin lifting with quiet resolve. "If this is my fate," she said, "then I will meet it with courage. Better to face the unknown than to waste away in fear." The wedding procession that climbed the mountain path 3 days later looked more like a funeral march. Psyche wore her finest white silk, but the flowers in her hair were cypress and rosemary, herbs of mourning. Her parents sobbed as they left her alone on the wind-swept cliff, but she stood steady as a stone pillar, watching them disappear down the mountain path. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the west wind rose around her. But instead of the harsh mountain gale she expected, it felt like gentle hands lifting her, cradling her as carefully as a mother holds a sleeping child. She found herself floating, carried on currents of air that smelled of cedar and honeysuckle, over valleys she had never seen, and forests that stretched like green oceans beneath her feet. The wind set her down in a garden, where every flower seemed to bloom in perpetual spring. Before her stood a palace built of materials she could not name, walls that shimmered like pearl but felt warm as sun-heated stone, columns that appeared to be carved from solidified moonlight, gardens where fountains played music instead of merely bubbling with water. "Welcome," said a voice like honey poured over gold. She could not see its source, though she turned in every direction. "This is your home now, Psyche. Everything here exists to serve you." Invisible hands led her through rooms filled with wonders. They bathed her in water that smelled of roses, and dressed her in silk softer than clouds. They brought her food that tasted like ambrosia, and wine that sparkled with captured starlight. As night fell, the voice returned, closer now, speaking from the darkness of her bedchamber. "I am your husband," he said, and she could hear the smile in his words. "The oracle spoke truly, but not as your parents understood. I am indeed feared by gods, for love is the most dangerous force in all creation. But I will never harm you, beloved. I ask only that you trust me and never try to see my face." "Why must you remain hidden?" she asked, reaching toward the sound of his voice in the darkness. His hand found hers, and his touch was warm, gentle, achingly familiar, though she had never felt it before. "There are things you are not yet ready to know," he said. "Promise me, Psyche, promise you will not try to look upon me." She promised, and in the weeks that followed, she discovered what it meant to be truly happy. Her mysterious husband came to her only in darkness, but his voice became as dear to her as sunlight, his touch a comfort that made every day worth living. They talked through the long nights about everything and nothing, her childhood fears, his struggles with his divine family, the dreams they both harbored for a future together. "I love you," she whispered one night, the words emerging like flowers blooming in her heart. "And I love you," he replied, "more than my own immortal life." But happiness, like all beautiful things, proved fragile. One morning, as Psyche walked in her garden among flowers that sang with the voices of nightingales, she heard familiar laughter carried on the wind. Her sisters had found her. How, she could not imagine, for no mortal path led to this place of magic. They embraced her with tears and exclamations, but their eyes took in the palace, the garden, the silk of her dress, with expressions that were not entirely joyful. "You've done well for yourself," said her elder sister, touching a golden goblet that refilled itself with wine. "Though we worried when we heard about the monster you were meant to marry." "He is no monster," Psyche said quickly. "He is kind and gentle, though—" "Though what?" her younger sister pressed, and Psyche found herself explaining about the darkness, the hidden face, the mysterious nature of her beloved. Her sisters exchanged glances heavy with meaning. "Oh, sweet Psyche," the elder said, shaking her head sadly. "Can't you see? He hides his face because it's too terrible to look upon. You're sharing your bed with some horrible creature, a serpent, just as the oracle said. He's probably only waiting for you to grow fat with child before he devours you both." "That's not true," Psyche protested. But doubt had been planted like a seed in fertile ground, and she found it growing despite her efforts to root it out. When her sisters left, they pressed into her hand a small oil lamp and a sharp knife. "Tonight," they whispered, "when he sleeps, light the lamp and look upon his true face. If we're wrong, you'll have nothing to fear. But if we're right—" That evening, her husband's voice seemed different somehow, sadder, as if he sensed the change in her heart. "You are quiet tonight, beloved," he said, stroking her hair in the darkness. "I'm only tired," she lied, and hated herself for the deception. When his breathing grew deep and even beside her, she slipped from the bed with trembling fingers and lit the small lamp. Golden light spilled across the room, and she turned to look upon her husband's face for the first time. She gasped, nearly dropping the lamp in her shock. Instead of a monster, she saw beauty beyond imagination. A young man with golden hair that caught the lamplight like spun sunbeams. Skin perfect as marble, but warm with life. Great white wings folded against his back like a swan. At his side lay a silver bow and arrows that gleamed with their own inner fire. This was no serpent or demon. This was Eros himself, god of love, lying vulnerable in sleep beside her. A drop of hot oil fell from the lamp onto his shoulder, and he woke with a cry of pain, not physical, but deeper. The sound of trust shattered beyond repair. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw love transformed into something like grief. "Psyche," he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like a farewell. "You promised." "I'm sorry," she began, but he was already rising, his great wings spreading wide. "I love you. I was afraid." "Love without trust is not love at all," he said, and his voice carried the weight of divine judgment. "You have chosen doubt over faith, fear over love. I cannot stay where I am not trusted." He flew from the window, leaving her alone in a palace that began to crumble around her like a dream upon waking. The beautiful walls faded, the singing flowers fell silent, and she found herself standing in an ordinary field under the cold light of dawn, wearing nothing but a simple shift, the lamp broken at her feet. For months that stretched like years, she wandered the mortal world searching for her lost love. She climbed mountains to pray at abandoned temples, crossed deserts where the sun baked her skin dark as leather, followed rumors and whispers that led nowhere. Other gods turned away when she approached their altars. None would risk Aphrodite's wrath by helping the girl who had stolen her son's heart. Finally, she arrived at Aphrodite's greatest temple, her feet bloody from walking, her hair tangled with dust and thorns. She prostrated herself before the goddess's statue and wept tears that had been gathering for months. "I surrender," she whispered. "Do with me what you will, but I beg you, let me see him again, even if only to ask his forgiveness." Aphrodite appeared in a swirl of rose petals and sea foam, her beauty terrible in its perfection. "So," the goddess said, circling Psyche like a hunter examining prey, "the little mortal who dared steal my son's affections comes crawling at last. You want to see Eros? You want his love? Then you must prove yourself worthy of a god's devotion." She gestured, and 4 great piles of seeds appeared, wheat, barley, millet, and poppy, all mixed together in chaotic heaps that reached higher than Psyche's head. "Separate these by dawn," Aphrodite commanded, "every seed in its proper pile, or you will never see my son again." It was an impossible task. The piles contained millions of seeds, each grain smaller than a fingernail, and sunset was already painting the temple walls gold. But as Psyche knelt before the overwhelming task, something miraculous happened. A single ant emerged from a crack in the marble floor, followed by another, then dozens, then thousands. The tiny creatures worked through the night with perfect organization, each carrying seeds to their proper piles, while Psyche watched in wonder. When Aphrodite returned at dawn, she found every seed perfectly sorted. Her eyes flashed with anger, but she could not deny that the task was complete. "A lucky chance," she said. "Let us see how you fare with real danger." She pointed toward the distant hills where golden sheep grazed in a meadow. "Bring me a handful of wool from the fleece of those rams." Psyche walked toward the meadow, her heart growing heavy as she drew near. These were no ordinary sheep. They were creatures of the sun god, their fleeces spun from sunlight itself, their tempers as fierce as their beauty was magnificent. Their horns could pierce bronze armor, and their hooves struck sparks from the stones. As she stood at the meadow's edge, paralyzed by the impossibility of her task, a green reed growing by a small stream began to whisper in a voice like wind through leaves. "Wait, brave girl," it murmured. "Do not approach while the sun rides high and the rams rage with its fire. Wait until evening, when they rest in the shade of the olive grove. Then you may gather wool from the thorns where they have brushed past. Their fleece catches on every branch." She waited, and when the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the great rams grew docile and sought shade. Moving carefully from bush to bush, she gathered golden strands that sparkled like captured sunbeams, soft as silk but strong as bronze wire. Aphrodite's fury grew when Psyche returned with the impossible fleece. "Clearly you have found supernatural aid," the goddess said, her voice sharp as breaking glass. "But this third task will test your own courage alone." She held out a crystal vial no larger than Psyche's thumb. "Fill this with water from the Styx, the river that flows at the very heart of the underworld." The river Styx. Even the gods swore their most binding oaths by its waters. It flowed through the deepest caverns of Hades' realm, guarded by monsters that had never known the light of sun or moon. To reach it, Psyche would have to descend into the land of the dead itself. She took the vial with hands that trembled only slightly. Death held no terror for her now. She had already lost everything that made life worth living. If this task killed her, at least her wandering would end. The entrance to the underworld lay hidden in a cave on a mountainside where no grass grew, and even the hardiest weeds withered and died. As Psyche approached, the air grew cold despite the summer heat, and she could hear sounds that made her soul shiver. Distant weeping, the rattling of chains, voices calling names of the living who could no longer answer. At the cave mouth, a voice stopped her. Ancient, weary, but not unkind. "Turn back, child of light," it said. "The living have no place in the realm of shadows." She looked around, but saw no speaker. "I cannot turn back," she said to the empty air. "I have a task to fulfill." "And what task drives you to seek the waters of binding? What oath would you swear by the river of the dead?" "It is not an oath I seek," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I come to win back love through service to she who would keep us apart." The voice was quiet for a long moment. When it spoke again, it held a different note, something like respect. "Love," it repeated softly. "Yes, that is reason enough to brave even this darkness. I was mortal once, and I remember what it meant to love. Very well, I will help you, but you must listen carefully, for the underworld has rules that even gods must follow." The voice instructed her to take 2 coins for the ferryman, and 2 cakes of honey and barley for the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates. More importantly, it warned her of the temptations she would face. The lame man who would beg her to help him load his donkey, the dead man floating in the river who would plead for rescue, the women weaving who would ask her aid. "Help none of them," the voice said firmly. "Your compassion does you credit, but in the underworld, pity can be a trap. Keep your purpose fixed in your mind, and let nothing turn you from your path." With coins in her mouth and cakes in her hands, Psyche descended into the cavern. The walls soon disappeared into darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. The path led ever downward, through chambers where the air grew thick with the scent of earth and ending things. She found the river Styx flowing black as midnight between shores of gray stone. Charon the ferryman waited in his boat, ancient beyond measure, his eyes like pools of still water reflecting nothing. She spat 1 coin into her palm and offered it to him. He examined it with fingers like old leather, then nodded and gestured for her to climb aboard. The boat moved without oars or sail, gliding across water that seemed thick as oil and reflected no light from any source. On the far shore waited Cerberus, the 3-headed hound of hell, each head larger than a horse, eyes glowing red as coals, saliva dripping like acid from jaws that could crush stone. But when Psyche offered one of her honey cakes, the great beast's ferocity melted like ice in sunlight. All 3 heads wagged like those of a beloved pet, and the monster stepped aside to let her pass. The palace of Hades rose before her like a mountain carved from black marble, its windows glowing with cold fire. But Psyche's destination lay beyond it, in the deepest caverns where the Styx had its source. She followed the sound of rushing water through corridors lined with the statues of the dead, kings and heroes, poets and philosophers, all rendered equal by the democracy of death. At last she reached the river's source, a waterfall that poured from some unseen height, its waters black as the space between stars. But as she approached with her crystal vial, she realized the water fell from too great a height for her to reach, and the rocks around the pool were slick with spray, impossible to climb. Again, unexpected help arrived. A great eagle descended from the shadows, its eyes golden, its wings spanning wider than a man could reach. Without a word, it took the vial in its talons and flew into the waterfall's spray, filling the tiny vessel with water from the Styx itself before returning it to her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, but the eagle was already gone, vanishing into the darkness like a living shadow. The return journey tested every instruction she had received. The lame man appeared just as the voice had warned, struggling with sacks that spilled grain with each step. "Please, lady," he called, "just help me lift this burden. My back is bent with age, and my strength fails." Her heart ached to see his suffering, but she forced herself to walk past, remembering the warning. The man's pleas followed her, growing angry, then threatening, but she did not look back. At the river, a drowned man floated near Charon's boat, his hands grasping at the air as if seeking rescue. "Pull me up," he begged. "I have children waiting, a wife who weeps for me each night." Again, her compassion warred with wisdom, and wisdom won. She paid Charon her second coin and kept her eyes fixed on the far shore as the drowned man's voice faded behind her. The women weaving by the roadside were the hardest test. They sat at looms creating tapestries of incredible beauty, but their threads were tangled, their patterns going awry. "Sweet girl," they called, "you have young fingers, steady hands. Help us unknot these threads, and we'll weave your story into our tapestry. Your love will be remembered forever." The promise of immortality in art was almost more tempting than life itself. But Psyche fed her second cake to Cerberus and climbed toward the world above without stopping, though tears ran down her cheeks for all the suffering she had left behind. She emerged from the underworld, changed. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air sweeter. Even the pain of her separation from Eros somehow purified by her journey through the realm of endings. She had looked upon death itself and found it not an enemy, but a teacher, showing her what truly mattered in the brief span of mortal life. Aphrodite waited at her temple, and for the first time, the goddess's beauty seemed less terrible, more fragile somehow. She took the vial of Styx water with hands that trembled slightly, as if she had not expected Psyche to return. "You have completed your tasks," she said, and her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "But tell me, why? Why endure such trials for love of one who abandoned you?" Psyche considered the question, searching for words that could contain the truth she had discovered in the depths of the earth. "Because love is not something we possess," she said at last. "It is something we become. I did not do this to win him back. I did it to become worthy of the love he offered. Whether he forgives me or not, I am grateful for what he taught me about my own heart." Something shifted in Aphrodite's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. The goddess who had ruled love for eons found herself face to face with a mortal who had learned to love without condition, without expectation of return. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "I have underestimated what mortals can achieve when they set aside their fears." She looked toward the sky where storm clouds were gathering. "My son has been refusing nectar and ambrosia, wasting away like a mortal himself. He speaks your name in his sleep and will listen to no comfort I offer." Before Psyche could respond, thunder rolled across the heavens, and Zeus himself appeared in a shimmer of lightning and cloud. The king of gods looked older than usual, weariness showing in the lines around his eyes. "Enough," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Love conquers even gods, it seems. Eros is making himself ill. Aphrodite rages through Olympus like a storm, and the very concept of love grows confused in the mortal world. This must end." He gestured, and Eros appeared, not flying as Psyche had always seen him, but walking slowly, his great wings dragging behind him like broken things. He was thinner than she remembered, his golden hair dull, his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. "My son," Zeus said gently, "you have punished yourself enough for loving wisely but not well. And you, Psyche." He turned to her, and she found herself looking into eyes that held the wisdom of ages. "You have proven that mortal hearts can hold divine love without breaking. It is time to make this love eternal." He lifted a goblet that appeared in his hand, ambrosia mixed with nectar, the food of the gods that granted immortality. "Drink," he commanded, "and take your place among the immortals. Be goddess of the soul, the bridge between mortal hearts and divine love." Psyche took the goblet with shaking hands. The liquid inside sparkled like liquid starlight, warm against her palms. She looked at Eros, seeing hope kindle in his eyes for the first time since that terrible night when trust was broken. "I am sorry," she said, the words she had carried through all her trials. "I was afraid, and fear made me foolish." "And I was proud," he replied, stepping closer. "I demanded perfect faith from someone I kept in darkness. Can you forgive me as I forgive you?" Instead of answering with words, she drank the ambrosia in one long draught. Power flowed through her like liquid fire, transforming every cell, every breath. Her mortal flesh became something finer, more enduring, touched with the same golden light that surrounded the gods. Wings sprouted from her shoulders, not white like Eros's, but iridescent, shifting through all the colors of emotion, from joy's bright gold to sorrow's deep purple. When the transformation was complete, Eros took her hands in his, and their touch sent sparks of pure love cascading through the air like falling stars. "Welcome to Olympus, Psyche," Zeus said with satisfaction. "Goddess of the soul, wife to Love himself. May your union remind both gods and mortals that true love requires both passion and wisdom, trust and forgiveness." Their wedding was celebrated across both mortal and divine realms. The gods brought gifts of impossible beauty, flowers that bloomed in the depths of winter, songs that could heal broken hearts, light that could banish any darkness. Mortals felt their influence as well, finding their own loves strengthened by the example of a couple who had chosen each other again after loss, who had learned that love's greatest triumph is not never falling, but rising together each time they fall. Psyche and Eros built a palace where the mortal and divine worlds touched, a place where lovers could come to understand their own hearts, where souls could learn to love without conditions or demands. They had learned that love's true nature is not possession but liberation, not control but trust, not perfection but the courage to be perfectly imperfect together. In the years that followed, their story spread throughout the world, carried by poets and storytellers who understood that some truths are too important to keep in one place. It became a tale told to young lovers learning to navigate the complex territories of the heart, to married couples rediscovering each other after loss, to anyone who had ever wondered whether love could survive the trials that life inevitably brings. The king of the gods appeared with thunder and lightning, his presence filling the hall with crackling energy. He looked at the tableau before him, the grieving mother, the guilty lover, the torn daughter, and his expression was uncharacteristically thoughtful. "The pomegranate seeds bind you here," he said to Persephone. "6 seeds, eaten of your own free will. But perhaps the binding need not absolute." And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the stars seemed close enough to touch, those who looked carefully might catch a glimpse of 2 figures flying together across the sky, one with wings of white, one with wings like captured rainbows, their hands intertwined, their laughter mixing with the wind. They had learned the secret that the greatest love stories are not about finding the perfect person, but about choosing to become perfect for each other, day after day, through every season of joy and sorrow that love's long journey brings. In the underworld, where Psyche had walked in courage and compassion, her memory lingered like a gentle light in the eternal darkness. The spirits of the dead spoke her name with gratitude, remembering the girl who had shown them that love could endure even in the realm of endings, that some things transcend even death itself. Her story joined those of Persephone, who brought spring to darkness, Orpheus, whose music had moved stone hearts, and all the others who had found that love's true power lies not in avoiding suffering, but in transforming it into something beautiful, something eternal, something that makes even gods pause in wonder at the depths mortals can discover within their own hearts.